Hello and welcome to Literally. I'm Anthony Rosenberg and welcome back to another day of commas. This, I hope, is the last post involving our commas. It's the third one, so if you haven't seen the other two, I do recommend you go back and see them first because I'll make reference to them a couple of times during this post. Now, in the earlier posts, we looked at commas in coordination. There were two of them, two posts. And we talked about listing and using coordinating conjunctions. So we won't be looking at that again. Thank God, right? We're moving on to commas in subordination. Now, commas in subordination, there is a lot of stuff to cover, and I will only be covering today adverbials. Now, why is that? Because that seems to be where the main problem is. There are some other issues about adjective clauses, and I'll have briefly touch on that, but very, very briefly. So our focus today is using commas in subordination, specifically with adverbial clauses. So let's get into the hard stuff. Subordination, what is it? This is the dictionary definition. Everyone loves a dictionary definition, don't they? All right, to join two or more clauses, we'll be looking at those in a second, in which at least one clause is independent and at least one clause is dependent. So that means that there could be several of each of those clauses. There could be a couple of independent clauses and there could be a couple of dependent clauses. We'll be looking at simplified versions today, so usually sentences with one independent and one dependent clause, but you need to know that they can have several of either. What is a clause? That's a great question. Glad you asked. Let's get into that. A clause is basically a group of words, one or more, so a clause can actually be one word, containing one verb, at least one verb. So if you have one verb, that is one clause. But if your group of words has two verbs, then you have two clauses. So every time you have a verb that appears, it will turn that into a clause. Now, there are different ways that the verbs are being used. We'll be looking at a couple here. But essentially, if you have a verb, you have a clause. Surfing is fun. Here's a nice simple sentence, right? Looks really nice and easy. How many verbs do we have? So straight off the bat, you might say surfing is a verb. It is a verb. To surf is a verb. I surf on weekends. I surf every summer. Yeah. I surf with my friends. So it is a verb. Here, it is not working as a verb, but it's still a verb. So that means surfing is a clause. Is also a verb, comes from the verb to be. So if we have two verbs, then we have two clauses. Got it? All right, let's have a look at some others that are a little bit misleading. So I like fishing. If you think back to what we just looked at for surfing, it would suggest that fishing is a verb. And you would be right. Now, I'm going to use different colors here. Red, I'm always going to use red to show our independent clause. So through the rest of this post, we want to remember that red means it's our independent clause. It's the one that can stand alone. We'll look at that shortly. And fishing is the dependent clause. So that's our subordinate clause. Dependent and subordinate are synonyms. So when I say dependent clause or subordinate clause, you know what I mean. Yeah, so this sentence has two clauses. Like is being, I like is the independent clause and fishing is the dependent clause. I like fishing depending on the weather. How many verbs? Well, we know that I like fishing is two because we've got like is the independent clause. Fishing is the dependent clause or the subordinate clause. Depending on the weather, another verb. It is also a dependent clause. You might start asking, what is dependent or subordinate? What does this mean? I'll get into that very shortly. But at the moment, we just want to be able to identify the clauses. Here's another one for you. The dog sitting there is a husky. So how many verbs have we got? Two. Is the independent clause, the main clause, if you like, and sitting there is the dependent clause because sit is a verb. It was built in 1897. This could be referring to any building or monument or anything like that. Now, this is a tricky one because was built works together, and this is what we call a verb phrase. but it is one idea, because the verb to be and a couple of other verbs have, be, have, I think actually they're the only ones, are often used as what we call auxiliary verbs. So they just kind of help the main verb. The main verb here is build, right? And in the past participle, built. So it just helps it helps to tell you that it is past. Yeah, it was built in 1897. This is a passive voice structure, if you want to know about that. So it was built. It doesn't tell you who built it. It just tells you that that building, or whatever it was, the monument, was built. This is a verb phrase. It's an independent clause. And a similar one would be, I have been to Italy. So have been here. Have is the auxiliary verb. Be is the main verb. That is the verb phrase, the independent clause. Now, I am going to get into dependent and independent because that's very important for you to be able to identify the main clause and the other ones which are not the main clause. So let's go back to surfing is fun, because it's a nice simple sentence, and it'll help us identify this idea of what's the main clause and what's not. So if we just take away is fun for the moment, we're left with surfing, which is a dependent clause. Remember, the blue circles will identify dependent clauses. So it's a dependent clause. Why? Because it cannot stand alone. If I come up to you and say, hey, John, how you doing? Surfing. And he would say, well, surfing what? What are you talking about? Are you surfing? It's like, no, we're in a classroom. Surfing, it's like, that doesn't really make any sense by itself. So it doesn't make it, there's no verb tense. I don't know whether it's past, present, future. I don't know who's doing it. I don't know what you're talking about. Are you saying that surfing is good, or surfing is bad, or you want to go surfing, or you went surfing, or you are going to go surfing? What's happening? Surfing doesn't mean anything. This actually is what we're going to call a noun clause. It's still subordinate, but it's not adverbial. It's just a noun clause. How do I know it's a noun clause? Because it can be substituted with the word this. Now, I'm not going to go on and on about noun clauses because that's not the idea of this post. The focus here is adverbials, but we need to understand the identification of clauses. So surfing, in our sentence, surfing is fun, actually represents this. So if I bring back is fun, you'll see that this is fun. So if I substitute surfing with this is fun. If you can imagine that we're out in the ocean and we're actually surfing, and I turn to you and say, hey, this is fun, you would understand that that's a full idea, an independent clause, a main clause. I understand that you're talking about something that we're doing right now, and I know exactly what you're referring to. This, surfing, the act of surfing, and I've got the main verb is fun right now. Now, if I change it to was, surfing was fun, so then I know that it's past, but the word surfing isn't in the past. The word was is in the past. So this is important to understand, that your noun clause probably isn't going to give you a time. It's your main clause that's going to tell you when this happened or what time you're referring to. All right, so your dependent clause or your subordinate clause cannot stand alone. It doesn't make any sense when you just say surfing, because everyone's expecting more information. When I say this is fun, you would understand whatever it is that we're doing is fun. So the independent clause can stand alone. The subordinate or dependent clause cannot stand alone. So we looked at surfing is fun, which I said was a noun clause. Now there are other subordinate clauses, which are adjective clauses. Again, remember, subordinate clauses or dependent clauses cannot stand alone. So adjective clauses also cannot stand alone. I'm not going to go into them today, but basically adjective clauses work like an adjective. They have a verb because it's a clause, but basically they describe a noun. Yeah, we'll get into that in another post. And of course, the adverbial clauses, which is the focus of our post today. So we are not looking at noun clauses and adjective clauses. We are only looking at adverbial clauses. Now, the subordinating conjunctions, you may remember back when we were looking at coordinating conjunctions in the previous posts on commas, we talked about coordinating conjunctions. So now we've got subordinating conjunctions for the adverbials. Now, there are over 100 possibilities. There are so many that it's just impossible for me to show you all the subordinating conjunctions. If you go online and put in subordinating conjunctions, and you put in adverbials, probably best, make sure that you get the right ones, you'll find hundreds of posts and lots of lists. I'm not going to list them off here, that's not my aim. But I've just chosen 4. The first one is if, the second one is although, the next one is when, and the last one is instead of. So I've chosen these 4 because they all present different aspects. The first one, if, talks about conditions. So if something happens, then something else will happen. And if can be present, past, or future. It can also be 0, meaning just talking about facts or habits. Although usually shows you a contrast of ideas, kind of like but it's subordinate, not coordinating. When obviously talks about time, and instead of shows you a contrast as well. But instead of is interesting because it has a preposition, so I wanted to show you one of those as well. Now if we put sentences to these, if it rains, I'll stay home. So the idea of identifying your subordinate clause and your independent clause is to see which one will stand alone. So if you eliminate the other clause, can that particular clause that you're looking at, can it stand alone? So if it rains, if I say to you, if it rains, you would be like, okay, finish the damn sentence. Finish it. Because it doesn't make any sense by itself. It cannot stand alone. But if I say, I'll stay home, you understand that I'm not going to wherever it is that the context tells you about. But I'll stay home is an independent clause. If it rains, dependent, I'll stay home, independent, your main clause. Remember the red circles I'm using are identifying the main clause or the independent clause. What about this one? Although I am short, I play basketball. Again, isolate the clauses. Although I am short, you want to know what's the contrast. Although you're short, you can do something. But if I say to you, I play basketball, you're like, great, congratulations, you play basketball. So I play basketball is your dependent clause, and although I am short is your independent clause. Remember, red circles show the independent clause, the one that can stand alone. When she won, she cried with joy. So again, separate them, isolate them, try them by themselves. She cried with joy. Well, that's fair enough. We can understand that. When she won, if I came up and just said, when she won, you'd be like, what happened? What happened when she won? So our dependent clause or subordinate clause is when she won, and she cried with joy is our independent clause. And now the one with the preposition, instead of running, he walked the marathon. So again, isolate them. He walked the marathon. You're like, wow, that must have taken a long time. So there's an independent idea. It can stand alone. But if I come up and say, instead of running, you'd be like, okay, what are you proposing? Instead of running, should I take a taxi? So your dependent clause, your subordinate clause is instead of running, and the independent clause is he walked the marathon. Now you'll notice in all of these clauses, the four sentences that I've offered you, I put the subordinating conjunction at the beginning because it was just easier to show that this way. That is important. In our next slide, it will be very important. But it shows you that basically in this particular order, the four of them came first. Instead of running was slightly different because it has a preposition. So after the preposition of, the verb run comes in the gerund form, the ing form. So after prepositions, generally verbs, if they are verbs, they'll come in an ing form. Now I'm going to get into that in more depth when we get into noun clauses, but at the moment, the group of words instead of running, that's an adverbial clause. Yeah, we'll break it down later, but not in this post. There are some of the examples of adverbial clauses. Commas in subordination. Now, commas in subordination are all about one thing, positioning. It's where things are. So I'm going to take our example from before. Although I am short, I play basketball, right? And you'll notice that we have a comma. Right? So the comma is there to separate the two clauses, the independent clause and the subordinate clause, if you like. Yeah. So let's swap it around. Let's move things around. Well, hold on. Before we do, as I said, there's your subordinate clause, and there's our independent clause, but I'm going to change them around. I play basketball, although I'm short. So I've swapped it around, and you'll notice that there is no comma. And you're like, wow, it's magic. Not really. It comes from an idea that we have an order of things in English. The standard English word order in a sentence is that we do a subject, and a subject in this case is I, so I am the subject. We need a verb, which is part 2, yeah, and the verb in this case is play. So we're following the order, right? S, subject, V, verb. And of course, you must have guessed it, the object is basketball. I play basketball, so SVO. And that is our main clause, our independent clause. Remember, if I isolate from the other one, I have my independent clause. I play basketball. And be like, great, I play golf, or I play soccer, I play football. Now we have the adverbial. Now the adverbial is the whole group of words there because the subordinating conjunction introduces that group of words. So although is part of the adverbial clause. It is a clause because we have the word am, which is a verb. So although I am short is your adverbial clause. It actually has a very complicated name. It's what we call an adverbial clause of contrast. So subordination, all adverbial clauses are subordinates or subordinating clauses. And this particular one shows a contrast, or some grammar places will call it a clause of concession. If you like the more sophisticated Latin words, fine. I like contrast because it's nice and short and easy to say. So the adverbial clause of contrast shows you a contrast between usually people who are short, you know, they might opt for a different sport, a sport where short people have an advantage. Because usually in basketball, I'm not saying all the time, but usually short people, they have a disadvantage in basketball. So there's a tendency for taller people to play basketball. And so the contrast of ideas or concepts here is that, well, you're short, but you play a tall person's game. So there's the contrast. I play basketball, although I'm short. That order, SVO adverbial, does not require a comma because that is the standard order, therefore no comma. Subordinating clauses, you should know, cannot stand alone. I've said it a million times and I'll say it again. Subordinating clauses or dependent clauses cannot stand alone. Just having a look there, although I'm short, you need more information for that sentence to make any sense. Whereas I play basketball by itself makes sense. Now, just to make things even more complicated, your adverbial clauses can move around. We've seen some examples where the adverbial clauses have been at the beginning, although I'm short, I play basketball, and we haven't seen them anywhere else. So we'll start off with one that goes against our standard word order. Remember, SVO plus our adverbials. And just like the although I'm short, we've got this one. To win, we must think strategically. Once again, isolate the verbs. To win is a verb, yeah, and must think is a verb clause, a verb phrase, sorry, yeah, it's a verb phrase. So to win is our adverbial clause because by itself it doesn't make any sense. I come up and say, to win, you'll want more information, don't you? But if I say, we must think strategically, you're like, yeah, we must. So you automatically understand everything because it's talking about a duty or a responsibility, yeah? And it gives you a complete idea. You don't have any doubts about, you know, within the context of what you're talking about, what that sentence means. And you'll see there is a comma because the adverbial clause is not in the particular, the standard position of the word order in English. So when your adverbial moves around, you got to have a comma. That was pretty easy because we've seen some examples like that earlier. Let's move on to a slightly trickier one. So the firm, instead of upping prices, kept them the same. So we've got two verbs. We've got upping prices. Yes, believe it or not, the verb to up. To up something is to increase. Usually it's about money or prices or values or amounts, things like that. We usually say up something. Yeah, it's not a very common verb, I get it. So up prices, increase prices if you like, and keep keep something the same. So we've got two verb clauses, two verbs, therefore two clauses, right? Which one can stand alone? Let's try this one. The firm kept them the same. So if you understand that them is prices, yeah, so within the context of something, you might be talking about prices and the values of things, and you say, well, the firm kept them the same. And say, oh, okay, that was nice of them not to increase the prices like that. So it's a sentence, an independent clause that has a meaning. It tells you that it's past. Kept is the past of keep. It tells you who did it. So we've got the subject, we've got the verb kept, and we've got the object them. It kept the prices the same. So there's our independent clause, our main clause. Whereas instead of upping prices, if I isolate that and say, instead of upping prices, you would say, well, what happened? What was the opposite? What was the contrast? So here we have an adverbial clause of concession or contrast, and therefore we need commas because the adverbial is not in the standard position. It's actually in the middle. So we've seen 3 examples of where your adverbials go. At the beginning, like to in, needs a comma. In the middle, instead of upping prices, in the middle of the sentence, needs commas. At the end, doesn't need commas. Now, your turn to try out for yourself. Let's have a look at the first one. When I smile, you can see my teeth. You tell me, I'll take a couple of seconds and decide if the comma is correct. So let's do the first one together, shall we? You need to identify the independent clause and the dependent clause. So try them by themselves. When I smile, does that make any sense by itself? What about, you can see my teeth? That makes sense. It talks about the ability to see something, and probably at the moment. So we've got the main clause is, you can see my teeth. The main clause is after the adverbial clause of time, which is talking about when. When talks about time, obviously. So therefore, the comma is correct because the adverbial precedes the independent clause. The next one, he wouldn't have gone if he had known the truth. So this one here, you need to decide whether it needs a comma or not. Is it correct the way it is, or should we put a comma in? Isolate the clauses. We've got if there. So remember, if is a subordinating conjunction. So that means probably everything after if is one clause and everything before it is another clause. He wouldn't have gone. He wouldn't have gone. That makes sense. Obviously, we have our sentences in isolation, so you need a bit of context, but essentially, grammatically, that works as a sentence. He wouldn't have gone. But if I try, if he had known the truth, you would say, what would have happened? If he had known the truth? So our independent clause is, he wouldn't have gone. Our dependent clause is, if he had known the truth. Therefore, it is correct. We have SVO, in the red circle, and the adverbial is in the latter part of the sentence. Therefore, it is correct. No comma needed. In the next one, since I left, I haven't seen them. So this one's a bit tricky because there are verbs everywhere. So we've got the verb left, and we've got the verb phrase haven't seen. So let's isolate since I left from I haven't seen them. Let's go with I haven't seen them. I haven't seen them. You understand within the context of whatever them might be. It could be people, it could be, dogs, could be cars, could be, your glasses, your keys, whatever. Yeah. I haven't seen them. That gives you an idea of time, sort of in the latest, 10, 15 minutes, half hour, or from a moment in the past to now. Yeah. I haven't seen them. The other one, since I left, you want to know, well, what happened? What happened since you left? So here we have an independent clause, I haven't seen them, and a subordinate clause or dependent clause, since I left. That means this is wrong. It needs a comma. Let's put that comma in, shall we? Right. So there's our comma. That makes it correct. Since I left, comma, I haven't seen them because the adverbial is preceding the independent clause. Next one. Your legs after running a marathon will be sore. Now we do have a comma in here. That's interesting. Again, we have to isolate things to find the main clause and to find the subordinate clause. So what will be sore? We've got this verb will be, so there's our verb phrase, yeah, will be. What will be sore? Well, the marathon will not be sore. Running will not be sore. Your legs will be sore. Your legs will be sore is a good, clear sentence. Your legs will be sore. Within the context of a conversation, you'll understand that that is an independent clause. After running a marathon, if I just say that, isolate it from the others, after running a marathon, you're like, well, what happens after you run a marathon? Do you get a medal? Do you die? Do you need to eat more? Do you sleep for a week? What happens after you run a marathon? So after running a marathon requires more information. It cannot survive alone. Therefore, we have one comma, but it needs another one. Therefore, it is wrong. Let's put that other comma in. Yeah. There it is. Your legs after running a marathon. So here our adverbial clause is in the middle, which means it needs a comma either side. The last one. I was exhausted because I hadn't slept. So our two verbs are was exhausted and hadn't slept. They're both verb phrases because they're compound, right? So was exhausted, the verb to be tells you it's past, and hadn't slept tells you that it's past, even further in the past, what we call past perfect, but we won't get into that now. So we'll isolate it from the subordinating conjunction because. So the first part is I was exhausted. Within the context of a conversation, I was exhausted. You would understand that I was tired and it was in the past. So it's a complete idea. But if I just said, because I hadn't slept, you don't know what. Because I hadn't slept, I couldn't do the exam. Because I hadn't slept, I didn't know where I was. Because I hadn't slept, you'd need more information. Therefore, we have subject, verb, object in the beginning, and we have the adverbial at the end. This is correct. No comma needed. Isn't that amazing? So there you go. C and D, we had to put the commas in to make them correct. Without those commas, they would be incorrect. All right, that has been me, literally, Anthony Rosenberg. See you next time.